that way.
Good morning. And the panel, please come and join me. I suddenly realized I was up here by myself. I felt a little vulnerable. I will take this moment to say good morning to everyone and to tell you all I'm a little bit, I'm both excited and a little uneasy. My mom is in the building. She's in the back. She's in a motorized vehicle. She has the most beautiful white hair you've ever seen. She's Scottish and she's talkative. So I encourage you all, if you get a chance, to say hello. And I love you, Mom. I so appreciate you being here. Welcome. So maybe we should just dive in. Last week was an incredibly exciting moment. Had the great pleasure of participating in the Equity Summit conversation. And, we've said it several times, but I really do want us to hold. I know it's both maybe a little disappointing, but it is also a little inspiring that after 200 plus years, for the first time, the federal government actually has agency-wide plans on race and equity. First time in our history, y'all. Yeah. 90 plans, over 300 core actions. Shared this yesterday, but I think part of what makes this so exciting also is that 50 of those plans weren't mandatory. That was agencies voluntarily taking that on, right? And so it feels like we're, for the first time, we're in a moment. We've got Gare now with pushing up on 2 decades of history. We got the feds with real plans. And I think there's a real opportunity, a tipping point for us about the possibility of imagining issues of equity as what government does, right? Core set of expectations and responsibilities in what it means to be accountable to community. So our hope this morning is to talk a little bit about what some of that work has looked like for you all. And I want to start out by naming the Biden-Harris administration formalized this, but there have been many folks in federal government over the decades doing this work without formal permission, right? Making it happen. And so I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about what that journey has been like for you all, and maybe give folks here some ideas about possibilities and potential in really imagining what an equity through line looks like from the local level to the federal level. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in, and I keep thinking, my mom's here. I'm going to jump in, Carlton Ely. I'm going to start with you. And, Carlton is our Senior Director of the Federal Initiative on Race and Equity at Race Forward. And his work really literally feels like it's on fire these days. Carlton, you did this work for decades at the EPA. Just looking at last week, for someone, I wish y'all could have seen Carlton last week, because it was, for someone who'd been doing the work for decades, that smile, that sort of like, yeah, finally, made my week. What do you feel, so really holding that, what do you feel has changed?
Thanks, Glenn. And good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
As Glenn indicated, I'm the Senior Director for Federal Strategies at Race Forward. I worked at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for 20 years. And I just want to say congratulations to the Government Alliance on Race and Equity for another phenomenal conference and for inviting a conversation with leaders in the federal government, for many of whom are learning about GARE and learning about this network and learning about the great work that you've been doing over the span of the past 10 years or so. For me, I think it is important to honor and to recognize what happened last week, because it was historic. When I worked as a civil servant, we didn't have conversations as took place last week at the White House in terms of senior officials normalizing a discussion about racial equity. Often the platitude is these are issues that are beyond our purview, beyond our responsibility. We're not clear if these issues are even mission critical. And it was great to see senior officials, leaders in the racial equity movement, officials from the Office of Management and Budget and from the Domestic Policy Council affirming that yes, equity is our responsibility. It is within our purview. It is mission critical. And what I'm most excited about, especially as a former civil servant, is the fact that it sends a very clear message from the highest levels to even those persons who are junior level employees working in civil service, is that you now have the space and an aperture has been created to focus on ways in order to operationalize and normalize this work without one being labeled as not being a team player or being labeled as being perhaps a rogue in terms of their duties, but the reality is that this is central to how you do business, and this is the work of right now.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I want to just open this conversation up to everyone else. And I'm going to invite you all to share your name and title again, just so folks can put faces to names. But your reactions from last week, are you feeling it's real? Are you concerns about implementation? Are you, more than anything, what are your hopes?
Okay, so I'm going to jump right in here. Again, my name is Marilyn Shazler, and I'm a senior advisor with the Department of Transportation in our policy office with the Office of the Secretary. And good morning to you all. So first of all, just understand this is progress. This has been a long journey for all of us and for all of you sitting here in the room and all of you viewing. And this is a major milestone in this journey. So EO 13985 is one of several executive orders that now give us as federal employees the permission to have this conversation. And that is significant for those of us who've been around for a while, who were downplayed in the past. It provides us the opportunity to take a step back and look at ourselves as organizations to have those hard conversations about what real impact we have had and will continue to have with the funding that we actually provide. It provides us with an opportunity to push ourselves beyond the status quo, to challenge ourselves when we're in the meetings, when we're developing the policy, and we're the ones who are actually establishing the standards for how the funding will be spent. It provides us an opportunity as an agency to review and update our guidance and our policy so that we can remove any ambiguity that currently exists that allowed some to interpret and implement our policy in ways that was not always beneficial to all. It provides us an opportunity to consider the intersection of transportation, in particular for the Department of Transportation, and how it impacts the lives of people in the community, and how we need to engage the people in the community more actively, less passively, to make sure we can consider their needs and expectations. And last but not least, it provides us an opportunity to leverage the authorities that we have as a federal agency in a way that we never have before. So we are becoming very more actively, not necessarily aggressive, but more active about how we're enforcing things. As federal agencies, we're all extremely excited about the work that has occurred over the last year and looking forward to continuing to working with everybody in this room, everybody who's engaging in this conversation moving forward.
Beautiful.
And I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things Marilyn said. I think it's important, and my name is Matthew Tejada. I'm the Director of Environmental Justice at EPA. Worked with Carlton for a long time. I don't know why you left, but I'm so happy to see you today. But to Marilyn's point, I mean, it doesn't just allow us, it tells us to do it, right? It told us to do it. And that was such a big deal at EPA. Really being able, again, just as Marilyn said, to have this conversation and have it in a way that we've never been able to have before. And at EPA, that was really important because it's allowed us to finally really center in people's minds that our mission, issues of equity and issues of justice and thinking and understanding race and the history behind what has happened across our country, it's not just a good thing. It's not just something we do on a Friday afternoon when we have time or at the end of the fiscal year when we have a few $1,000s laying around. It is central to our mission. It is a part of what we are supposed to be doing, whether it's providing transportation access or protecting public health and environmental quality. It has centered that in our mission. That's something that Administrator Regan speaks to all the time, is the centering of our mission on environmental justice. And a lot of people, at least in my world, a lot of people get really, I think, focused on some of the other things we're working on, like Justice 40, which is in another executive order. I like to remind folks all the time, the president signed this executive order on the first day.
That's right.
This was the first day executive order, and we spent at least as much time in EPA working on this executive order as we have on any others. We spent an incredible amount of time throughout 2021 doing those barriers analysis and coming up with this action plan and tying it in to everything else we're doing, which I know a lot of folks don't get into the bureaucracy of everything else we've published for the last year, but we put an enormous amount of work into making sure that this would be something that stuck, that this would be something that was implemented. And if this was the only thing we did at EPA in this administration, all by itself it would be historic. It's one of many things, right? There's a whole palette of things at EPA and across the federal government because this administration, I think, really gets it. It takes all of government. Equity and justice are historic, generational issues that are going to take fundamental change in how we govern. And this is going to help us, regardless of future administrations, regardless of future executive orders of policies. These sorts of efforts that mandate everyone in the federal government paying attention and putting their work into it, these are the sorts of things that have impact through administrations, making the conversation happen, getting the awareness out there, getting people ready and understanding and in touch with, the history of our society and our responsibility as civil servants to lift up this conversation and connect our mission to the reality that so many communities continue to face.
That was a very
Yes.
very good response. I don't know if I can follow that, but my name is Earl Redrick, and I'm with the U.S. Department of Housing, Urban Development, Field Office Director for our Fort Worth Field Office. I was sitting here listening to my two colleagues, and I was contemplating. These guys gave a very formal response
They did.
to your question. I'm going to diverge. I'm going to give you a less formal response. Nonetheless, I think accurate, because I believe your question was, is there any consternation, concerns about
And what are your hopes?
equity being sustained across government?
Yes.
When I think about this particular work, and being a being an old guy at this particular point, who's studying this particular issue, I think of three words: leadership, policy, and then equity itself, the outcomes around equity. I think, and I am hopeful, that through the actions of the president, the vice president, and at HUD, I can speak for HUD, our Secretary Fudge, and our senior leadership, that we are serious about this particular issue. Are there concerns? Will there be challenges? What does that look like long term? The answer to the yes, there are concerns. Yes, there are challenges. As you all know better than I do, and probably those of us on the stage, this work is messy, right? And you're talking about a big bureaucratic machine that you're putting on a train of change. What's that gonna look like long term? How many people are gonna be left behind? All of those things go into to thoughts and concerns of mine. But I think those three things, I'll close out with those three things, I think will get government there, specifically at HUD. The right leadership, which I think we have. I know we have, not a think. I know we have. Thinking about policies, which most of us, and especially at HUD, we're re-examining our policies to see what are the equitable outcomes and things we've historically done. And then what does equity mean to HUD, the folks we serve, and to our internal workforce. So I'm hopeful we're going to get there.
I love, and thank you for keeping it real. Because, I mean, this is a room full of folks who know these very questions of what does leadership mean when it comes to equity, and especially elected leadership, right? The question of how do we actually get real, like what are we measuring in our policies, right? And the ultimate question, like, is it having any impact? These are all questions for anybody committed in government to making equitable change have to wrestle with. It is the work. And so I think in that way, I wanted to name a couple things. First off, I have some questions. I hope that everybody thinks they're good, but we wanted to make sure that if you had questions, you could actually put them in the mix. So I want to encourage anyone as we're going through our conversation, you have a question, write it down. We're going to have some folks come around and collect them and hopefully be able to answer some of your questions at the end of the panel. The other thing I just wanted to name, because you all touched on it so beautifully, is jumping back for everyone in understanding the executive order itself. So the executive order on race and equity was put in place on day one. And for us, that, for this audience, I think it's so important for the GARE membership to hear the executive order was deeply informed by what you all have been doing over the last, decade and a half. And it was, yeah.
Celebrate that.
Appreciate that. I really do, Matthew, because I think, just being, to tell a very short, but I think important story is Race Forward has been participating on a group called the Kellogg Racial Equity Anchors, core group of folks funded by Kellogg working on issues of racial equity for the last 10 years. And it includes a bunch of the historic civil rights organizations, NAACP, UNIDOS, Urban League, and a bunch of us sort of, a little newer racial justice organizations. And as we were building up to the election, the group said, what is it that we're going to ask of the administration? What is it that we should be asking of the administration as it's coming in? And the beauty of the work that you all have been doing, I say this a little sheepishly, I didn't propose it. The head of the NAACP said, we should ask them to do what GARE is doing, right? It's felt, and I say that, it's so important you all hear that I know on a daily basis it doesn't always feel like it is, but it is, and it adds up. And that resulted in a whole slew of organizations from across the country rooted in communities saying to the Biden-Harris administration, you gotta do that. That's what you gotta do. And they responded. And so in that way, maybe in this next question, so as we think about this, I deeply believe change has always happened locally. You know what I'm saying? That civil rights movement wasn't a national movement, it was a movement in Birmingham that became national. And I think in that way, this connection between what folks, whether you're at the city or working directly with communities or at the state level, that through line matters. And so my next question for any of you is, what are the implications? Any initial thoughts about the implications and opportunities in sort of bridging that gap through the plans and the executive order between local, state, and federal?
Let me start off. The important thing that I want to acknowledge, and Glenn, you've already alluded to this, is the fact that the landscape has changed. And we need to celebrate that in terms of the work that has been occurring over the span of the past 10 and a half years. We are at the point now where there are many national non-governmental organizations that have clear position statements on the importance of addressing racial equity, whether it's the National League of Cities or the International City County Management Association. Within the past 5 years, the American Planning Association has re-energized their focus on these issues, even the American Institute of Architects. And so the important thing to note is the fact that as the federal government starts to take its next steps, it's important to acknowledge that they are not entering into a lonely space. They're entering into a space where there is a real opportunity for solidarity. And so it's important to make sure that they know that they're amongst good company in terms of trailblazers and other leaders who are willing to work arm in arm as we make our country better and create the multiracial democracy that we all deserve.
Go ahead.
You put me on the spot. I didn't want to. No, that's fine. I always got to make levity of the situation. For those sitting out there and those online and you're looking, it's like, why is that guy's head glowing? I intentionally did that. I put oil on my head, I buffed it out, and I said, the light is going to distract folks so they don't hear what I'm saying. No, seriously. No, I'm joking. To answer your question, and to echo the sentiments of our top leader at HUD, Secretary Fudge, I think she said this very poignantly when she said, this is a journey, right? If we think that just doing, an assessment and then action plans and turning that stuff in and handing it over to the staff, we are going to move the needle on equity, then I think we misunderstand the messiness of this particular work. She was clear in saying how this is a journey. It provides a roadmap for where HUD wants to go. And at this particular moment, when we think about alignment, we started out, because what I've learned in this particular process, and I heard from a good friend of mine, you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time. I don't know if I've never eaten an elephant, but that's what he always said to me. You can only do this work, thinking about it, in incremental changes. And at our organization, we took on 4 of our big program areas, which is procurement, fair housing, home ownership, and homelessness, and thinking about where do we miss equity within those particular program outcomes, and then how do we better align them from our organization to the state, to the local governments.
And I'd like to pick up on a couple things that both you and Carlton just shared as well. And a couple things that I'm really focused on, since I'm a career executive, and as long as I don't screw up too badly, like I get to go through administration. So I've been around for a few of them now. And what I've learned, and I'm not just speaking, please don't think I'm just speaking about the last administration. Because one of the things I've learned is that equity work is a fight, and it's a fight in any administration. It's a fight in any corner of government. It's always been a fight. It's going to be a fight for a while yet, right? This is still generational work. What Carlton said, though, about community is so important, right? The more that we can expand that community when we have the chance to do so, those things last. Community has legs. Bringing more people into the fold, and however challenging that can be for folks, but our ability to bring them in and to share education and to share awareness and do that in a way with an open embrace for folks, because it is tough. I mean, the things we're doing at EPA, I know at DOT and HUD and all the other agencies, it's the same. It is challenging. A lot of folks' reactions, people who are good people, and they've been doing this their whole careers, and I show up and they hear me saying that I think they've done a bad job for 30 years. And I'm like, no, I'm not saying you've done a bad job, but now I need you to do your job differently. Because there's parts of our community, there's parts of our society that haven't benefited from your efforts. And we're gonna have to do things differently for those folks to benefit too. That's equity work. And if you could start to bring those people into that conversation, that lasts. That lasts in this administration where there are still challenges. Right? I've been in half dozen conversations this week where I have vocalized to leadership, these are the barriers. See, that person's, that's a barrier. What they're trying to do, that policy, that's a barrier. And those policies are ephemeral. Leadership changes. Community can last. And one of the big things inside of community as well, as part of that education, one of the things I'm really focused on is transparency. And sometimes that can seem like a really banal word, right? Transparency. But transparency brings accountability. It's just an automatic, it kicks in, right? When we shine a light on what we do in the government, how we make our decisions, where our efforts show up on the ground, who's receiving our time and attention and resources, that transparency is powerful. I've seen it work in every administration. And it is threatening to folks initially, but if you can get folks aware of what's actually happening on the ground, if you can bring data to it, if you can bring numbers to it, if you can put it on a map, it starts to make something that can be really threatening and challenging for a lot of folks real and approachable and less scary. And I think whenever we have the opportunity to do that, to bring more people into that community and to be able to put down that foundation that'll last through any and every administration, we've got to jump on it.
So I'm going to piggyback on that and ditto to everything that's been said from you guys. Department of Transportation funds infrastructure projects. That is what we do. We give out a lot of money. So from that perspective, the biggest opportunity for us is to make sure that those projects benefit communities equitably. That means that every community has access, not just to the funding, but to the benefits of the funding, and that when those transportation projects are implemented, that the equity considerations are in place to make sure that all communities are represented. So we need to open that door. One of the things we're doing is opening that door to make sure everybody has a seat at the table. It's not just about race, it's about gender, it's about equality, it's about making sure whoever you are, if you need wheelchair access, that you have a position, a seat at the table to make sure we understand as an organization what your needs and concerns and challenges are, so that when that planner that's in the field or that engineer that's designing looks at it, they're designing it from an equity perspective. That, to me, is the biggest opportunity we have, is to make sure we're having impact in communities where people live every day.
Right on. Let's continue down that path. I should, actually, to your point, Matthew, I should lift up, if you go to the White House website, you can actually get access to all the plans, speaking of transparency. And there's many, I think there's a ton of opportunities for local jurisdictions to be thinking about, are there places of alignment and leverage? And so we'd encourage y'all to look, to see what the feds are actually naming. And to that end, I wanted to invite the three of you, can you give us, can you name something in the plan that you're excited about? Give it a little texture, you know what I'm saying? So folks get a little bit more sense of what we're really talking about.
So I'll start. So there's two things, there's a lot of things I'm excited about. All 6 things in my plan, I'm excited about all 6 of them. There's 2 that I'm most excited about, though. One is, and this is something that the equity and justice advocates have been asking for a long time, is that we're going to comply with civil rights, right? It sounds weird to say that.
It does.
Because it's a law. And sometimes we have to remind all of our lawyers, no, that's a law too. Got the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. Civil Rights Act is a law too. And we're going to comply with that. And that is some work. I mean, that is, when we're looking at structures and systems that have led to inequitable and unjust outcomes.
Yes.
The unfinished, and some would argue, and I wouldn't argue against them, the unstarted business of really bringing together our environmental laws with our civil rights laws. Mm-hmm. That is a big systemic structural change proposition. And this administration is the first administration that is saying, yep, it's tough, so let's start chipping away at it, right? Let's start making that progress. And we're going to bring together our civil rights authorities and our responsibilities with our environmental and public health responsibilities and authorities. That's a huge deal. So we're doing that, and we're making that clear. The other thing, and it goes to the same point as well, The Civil Rights Act has been around for over 50 years. The EPA itself has been around now for over 50 years. We have all these statutes on the books, but so many of our statutes have been implemented for 50 years in a remove from the realities of communities of color, right? So many of our policies, our rules, our permitting structures are based upon an assumption that just doesn't exist for any community, I would argue, but especially for communities of color and low income and indigenous communities. And we're finally going to do the really hard work of untying 50 years of some pretty naughty policies and precedents and practice to finally bring the issue of cumulative impacts and disproportionalities into the middle of what we're doing at EPA. That's a huge, thank you. That is challenging. I was in a room full of folks from the states yesterday who all run the drinking water programs across the states. This is a big deal, and we don't have all the answers, right? This is a lot of business that people have known was sitting there, advocates have known, community folks have known, folks in the government have known for years. That this issue of cumulative impacts was in the middle of the room, but it was such a white-hot thing, nobody was willing to put their arms around it. And again, to lift up the courage of this administration, folks like the president and the vice president and our secretaries, they're walking right up to it and wrapping their arms around it and saying, nope, we're gonna do this. We're gonna figure out this cumulative impacts piece. It's gonna be tough, it's gonna be painful sometimes, there's gonna be a lot of confusion, there's gonna be some hurt feelings maybe. Gotta get through it, because the folks on the ground whose health we're supposed to protect, whose environments we're supposed to protect, whose economies and ability to generate their own wealth and to have a vision of the future of their own communities, if we aren't regulating in a space where we're accepting the reality that they face when they wake up in the morning, when their children walk out the front door to go to school, right? When they come home and want to just sit outside for a half hour and enjoy the sunshine, if we aren't regulating in a way that respects and honors the realities that they face on a daily basis, we got no business doing this anymore. We got to figure that out.
I don't know why I have to keep following this guy. So when I think about HUD, I shared with you all just a few seconds ago, we took our initial phase, and I will say phase because our secretary did say this was a journey, a roadmap. So our first phase of this, 4 particular program areas we targeted, and I shared, those were procurement, fair housing, home ownership, and homelessness. I'll talk about one because I actually worked on this particular committee or work group, and that's home ownership. Historically, home ownership was to serve as that bridge or closing of the gap in wealth creation for families of color, right? In particular, African Americans at the time, but we say families of color. And I think we know present day that the home ownership rate for African Americans is less than what it was in 1960s when we started this particular work. So we've seen regression instead of progression. In that home ownership piece, I was really working with some really, really sharp folks, exceptionally talented. And we looked at a couple of things. Yes, HUD does home ownership. We targeting a certain income bracket of folks, and we want to get them into that wealth creation pipeline. What we realized was there were barriers and impediments to folks even tap into the access, right? So we had to really back up, and I'm talking in generals because I don't want to say these are the specific recommendations and the plans, but I do know we had to back up and look at how are folks even getting to the pipeline of access for home ownership. And what we realized there were impediments like credit, financial literacy, education, right? Before we can even then talk about getting folks ready to own homes. And even when we got folks in homes, what was the follow-up or wraparound services so that folks could sustain home ownership and then eventually grow into bigger and better home ownership, so if they choose. So the one part of that particular plan I'm most excited about and get to hug on and rave about is that home ownership piece. As a homeowner, first homeowner in my family, in my middle 30s, I can tell you it's been a phenomenal experience. And it does change lives. It does change the trajectory of your life for you and your family. So I'm most excited about that.
So you want to really know what I'm most excited about?
I do.
It's the fact that our plans, I have not read their plans. There's so much alignment there, is what I'm hearing.
I love this.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
So DOT's Equity Action Plan has 4 main goals: wealth creation, reinvigorating our Title VI, expanding access, and then there's an interventions category, which I would need to explain a little bit to help you understand what that is. But there's so much alignment with what we put in place and what the other agencies are putting in place from what I'm hearing here. That's extremely exciting. We have actually 20 actions that are tied to those 4 goals, and we are not going to go through all 20 of those right now. First of all, I can't remember all 20 of them. I'm 58 years old. That's difficult. But they all align. So the ones, I'm excited about all of them. Excited to think about the fact that we as a transportation organization are spending the time and energy to really understand how transportation can help create wealth for communities. How we as a transportation organization are using data and technology to create tools and resources so that our funding partners will be required to tell us how they're going to have positive, equitable impact when it comes to transportation projects. So we are really, I'm not going to go through all of the things that we're doing, but as an organization over the past year, we have spent a lot of time thinking about this in terms of how we're not just going to leverage our authorities, but to leverage the resources that we have to make sure that at the end of the day, the community see the impact that they need. Some of the tools that you will see coming, where some are in development, some are in beta, some are already on the street in beta. But as you see those tools come out, you will hear us request input on how effective those tools are for you guys who have to use them. Please give us that feedback, because that's how we know if it works. But I'm really excited to see that we are going to that level of detail in our work to make sure that we have that positive impact.
Beautiful. Carlton, any reflections? I'm going to shift this up in a second to maybe to get to some specific questions for you, but anything you want to add?
The only thing that I would add is, as I was listening to Marilyn and everyone else speak, is, I mean, where the conversation is going is clearly we've jumped the shark, we've crossed the threshold. But the point is that obviously within many federal institutions for a long time, they've had very narrow socialization boundaries. Glenn, our friend Susan Gooden at Virginia Commonwealth University wrote a book, Race and Social Equity in Nervous Area of Government. And in the book, I mean, she did a phenomenal job as an academic explaining that the tension in terms of many institutions is the fact that the boundaries that basically define what a public servant should do are so narrow that not only does it affect the performance of individuals, it affects the performance of those institutions to do their jobs effectively. And so this conversation, whether we're talking about the environment or housing or transportation, is really about how do we make sure that we expand those socialization boundaries, which in turn helps to open that aperture a little bit further.
True that. And one of the things that I loved, Marilyn, that you just named, and I think there's a lot of folks in the room who can speak to the truth you named, is that part of the power of having it organization-wide, across the whole of federal government, is not just the great work that each of you named individually, but what happens when those synergies actually start to click in. The way in which that can actually push agencies and departments to actually compete a little bit for what success looks like in this work. And I think that's essential for success. So I wanted to sort of lean in. Let me do two things though. For folks who are watching online, Please also let us know if you have questions. And for folks here as well, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to jot them down, and we will send someone around the room to collect them shortly. But Matthew, let me start with you. The EPA created the Office of Environmental Justice in 1992. Your office spans 5 political administrations, and you've seen the pendulum swing a little bit over that period of time. What strategies has your office faithfully employed ahead of each new administration, which supported longevity? And I'm naming the longevity of, you captured it beautifully. You all have been pushing on issues of equity for decades. So what has worked for y'all?
We're advocates. And that in and of itself was a challenge. One of the things, how much to talk about? We recently, in a recent administration, had a lot of time to look at our own navels. Because we weren't being told to do a whole lot necessarily. And one of the things that we chose to do was really to define for all the folks who are in our program, the EJ program at EPA, which is larger than just the folks in my office. Even in the last administration, I'd say we were around 80 or 90 people that would be a part of the EJ program at EPA. That's going to rapidly expand now in this administration. It already has been expanding. But one of the things that, was kind of a challenge was EPA is full of lawyers and engineers and scientists and folks in our program is like, well, what are we? And it took us a while, it took me a while to convince our folks. I was like, y'all are advocates. I'm like, well, what's an advocate? That's what those people on the outside do. It's illegal for us to be advocates. I'm like, bullshit. You're advocates. That's what your job is. You can't walk into any room and tell anybody what to do in this agency. But you got to convince them to do it. You've got to use advocacy tools to get them to do it. You've got to use persuasion. You've got to use support. You've got to use facilitation. You've got to bring the voice of the community inside the building, right? That is your biggest weapon. And so we've started to very aggressively and very clearly train our folks in EPA and the EJ program as EJ advocates, because that's what we do. And that continues to be a bit of a challenge, but it is at its core what we do. And one of the things that's so important in that, and the EJ leaders out there would share this, it doesn't matter who's in charge. We're going to find a way to make progress. It might not be the thing that we think is most important necessarily. We might have to go to the thing that may be second important or third important, but we're going to find the area where we can wiggle in there and we can start to shove our elbows out and create a little more space and push forward a little more. We're going to find the places where we can get work done and where we can make progress. And it just might surprise you, and maybe one of the reasons they hired me is because I'm from Texas and you grew up doing this. You grew up with the challenge. In a lot of ways, the last administration was a lot more comfortable place for me to be than some other administrations because the stakes were clear and the dynamic was obvious. But you're going to find a way to get work done. And sometimes in those administrations that you might not think are going to be as available to doing this sort of work, if you approach it as an advocate, you're going to find these little footholds and these little hooks where you're like, you can do some substantial work and you can get some stuff done. And that is our job, that's our responsibility, that's our debt in being these civil servants, holding the front line of equity and justice, is that we have got to find those ways, regardless of the administration, regardless of the challenge, regardless of the budgetary situation or anything else, you find a way to make progress.
So appreciate you naming that deep truth. And in that way, President Biden has named this as a generational commitment, right? The work ahead of us, I know we all wish it was tomorrow, but there's work ahead of us. And if we're smart, we'll keep moving that goalpost to really understand what justice means. And so given that, how are you holding, let me start with you, Earl. How are you holding this question of internally around long-term sustainability in the ways that Matthew was naming?
I can answer that in two ways. I can answer that from my HUD hat and then from an individual employee hat, so that I don't get myself in trouble. I'm going to answer.
You want the individual?
No, I'm going to answer from my HUD hat. No, I don't want to get fired on the panel. So, so at HUD, I think handling that internally, we got to be honest with ourselves. It didn't. There's struggles and challenges with that. I'm trying not to look at my boss. She is here, and she's looking at me, giving me the side eye, like, Earl, you better not mess this up. There have been struggles and challenges, but I think the positive, the optimism, us embracing this at HUD, is that I really think leadership has to take the reins on this. The staff will come, but leadership has to. And at HUD, from Secretary Fudge, senior leadership, my boss, all the way down, directors, frontline staff, we are taking this thing seriously and by the reins. I think we'll talk a little bit later about specifically my division and what our boss did for us, my boss did for us here in a second, but we have to realize this just is not gonna happen overnight. We have to put in the work. We have to take time to do it right. In an ideal world, we would do it internally before we did it externally. Unfortunately, we didn't have that scenario in this space, but we still got to take our time, be patient to get it right.
I so appreciate it. I want to come back to that internal-external conversation, but before we do, Marilyn, thoughts about sustainability?
From our perspective, it's about institutionalizing change through structure, first of all. So Secretary Buttigieg jumped in feet first, didn't know how deep the water was.
Right.
But he's there, right there in the foxhole with the rest of us. And has given the leadership that has been put in place to lead on equity for the Department of Transportation the authority to move forward at a very quick pace. So we initially started with a task force that did the initial development of the work. That is now going to be institutionalized at the Department of Transportation as a council. That is a long-standing body that you cannot remove with a sweep of a pen. That's been very intentional. And then also just the matter of, as we move forward, bringing our staff to the table, bringing the implementers to the table, internal to our organization and external, to make sure that everybody is empowered to actually do the work. So it's a point for us where we had to have a serious conversation, and we're still having that conversation to talk about some of the internal angst that goes on with change. Sometimes we hang on to things at the top and don't allow it to filter down through the organization for the people who actually have to do the work, who, by the way, can tell us all the things we're doing wrong, because they know. So we're at that interchange where it's like, let's not just stay at this strategy, planning, discussion level. Let's actually resource the teams who have to do the work, give them the work and let them do it. And it may not always look exactly like what we expected it to look like, but as long as it has that positive impact in the field with the communities, I think we're gonna be okay.
I want to pick up, because that's such an important point.
Yeah.
And that's a point I make whether I'm talking to other folks in EPA or other levels of federal government or state or local or tribal or the private sector. If we don't start resourcing work on equity and investing in the practice and the profession of equity and engaging communities and lifting up the voice of the communities on equal basis with engineering and lawyering and sciencing and all the other parts of governing, right? If we don't start doing that, because it is so hard, right, when we're making the decisions that we've been making for generations, and we're like, well, the lawyers are good, we checked with them, and the scientists are good, we checked with them, and the engineers have done all their blueprints and everything else. Well, what'd the community think? Well, we don't know, we just asked them, and we had a meeting, but we don't really remember. It's like, well, let's go ahead. Like, we can't do that, and we can't send our baby lawyers and our junior engineers out there on Wednesday night to engage a community where they walk into a firestorm and they walk out with their hair on fire and they never want to go back because it sucks. Like, it is a profession. It takes skill. It takes emotional intelligence. It takes experience. And we have got to invest in and resource this work just like we do with our lawyer shops and just like we do with our engineer shops and just like we do with our science shops. And if you're not, I'll tell you right now, you're going to fail.
Can I add to that, Glenn?
Yeah, please.
So a quick follow-up to that, and I'll use one word to synthesize my comments: alignment. Yesterday, I said it, and I heard some very powerful presentations around data, community impact or collective impact, and so forth. What I will say at the federal level is thinking about equity, because we're really learning equity from you all, right? We have to be mindful as we go back to our organizations, to our agencies, and try to right-size that equity on the initial phase or the first wave. There has to be an alignment from us to the state down to you all. Otherwise, we, as I like to say at target practice, we miss the target, right? So I think that's something I know at HUD we're thoughtful about. I have those conversations with my colleagues. Like I said, my boss who's here, we've had those conversations all the time. And we were even fortunate enough to work with Carlton and his group to think about, do we have the right alignment in evaluating what equity looked like? So I'm really excited about how HUD is taking that approach to that.
I love this part of the conversation, and because the energy around it. I mean, you all said it in different ways, but it turns out that equity and justice is not just a set of values. It is a set of skills, right? I mean, at its core. And so can we talk a little bit more about that? I know for you, Carlton, this has been truly sort of core to your heart and hopes for the work, but would love to hear not only your thoughts, but other folks' thoughts about things that are working or things that you think are needed in terms of building those skills.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew said it quite elegantly, that clearly equity is not a soft skill. It is a hard skill. If it were a soft skill, everyone would do it. And so we have to be sensitive that we have to develop, skills and competencies so that persons can be more proficient in actually doing the work. And that's going to require making an investment in human resources. It doesn't happen by accident. Sharing my own personal experience, when I was working in civil service for 13 years, I made an investment in myself because the resources and the tools beyond the environmental justice program did not exist. And so I had to go out and go to conferences that normally the agency wouldn't participate in. I had to read books because there was no curriculum in terms of the type of books that focus on one's ability to develop a sense of understanding, whether it be emotional intelligence or whether it be developing one's ability to connect effectively and listen actively to the public. But we have to be mindful that while the skill development is important, it's not the end. It is a means to the end. But we have to be able to have a starting point that will allow one to develop the muscle. Because I don't even say that this is hard work. I say that this is demanding work. And whenever you're doing demanding work, you have to build the muscle in order to effectively address the issues that you're dealing with. I'm confident that people will start to see this and feel more comfortable with it and perceive it as being easy work as you start to develop your understanding, your knowledge, your proficiency around these issues. And that's really when it gets exciting, because you already have the experience of having gone down the path before. Now you know how to anticipate how to approach the issue differently the next time around.
Beautifully said.
Can I follow up to that?
Please.
So I think, through the vision of Secretary Fudge and the guidance of ADS Perez, who's here. Man, raise your hand for a second. I know I saw you somewhere. She left. She left the room. No, she is. Oh, there she is. ADS Perez. You guys talk to her. She loves to talk. I can't say she'll talk your head off, but she has some great wisdom, right? Great visionary leader. The first thing we realized is, and she shared with us, we don't know. We don't know equity. at HUD, you guys know, many of you use our programs, you're grantees, recipients. We do fair housing. We've always done fair housing. We have community development programs that have these specific requirements. We have homeless services grant that have these particular requirements. And then we have procurement that is supposed to improve participation with minority business enterprises and so forth and so on. But we didn't know equity. And it was thoughtful of ADS Perez to say, you know what? I'm gonna volunteer my division to participate in this pilot. And we did. Race Forward, PolicyLink, those guys came in and did a phenomenal job with helping us understand what equity is and isn't, giving us some phenomenal tools to put in our toolbox, giving us an equity action plan or a framework of a plan of how we could implement that, and then leaving us, letting it rest with us. This really is your work. You guys have to synergize, bring yourself together, put the right people in place, have you a equity working group across your division. You really have to codify this particular work for it to sustain growth, and then build momentum from the top down, bottom up. Those folks in the middle, I'll talk about them later. Get them on board and make this thing work. But I'm telling y'all, it was a phenomenal experience, and I'm saying that. The rest of y'all looking at me like, Earl, what's the big deal? We've been doing this for 20 years. In government, we have not, at least not in my division, my experience working at HUD.
Thank you.
Yep. And can I jump on that?
Yes. Oh, please.
Yes. So one of the things I want to talk about is how we need to skill up, hire up, and then we also need to be able to scale up, right? Department of Transportation did one of the most phenomenal things is they hired one of you as the Director of Civil Rights. And that's who Irene Marion is, and she's supposed to be sitting in this chair, and she's not here. But best decision ever, because she's been on fire since she hit the Department of Transportation, leading on equity on behalf of the Secretary with co-lead Christopher Coase, who is my actual boss in the policy office. But the fact that we have somebody at the department who understands how this works has really allowed us to move forward at a pace that we probably would not be able to. In terms of skills for staff, we don't expect our staff and our planners to be equity practitioners, right? But we want them to understand, and we will give them the training and the resources to be able to get to this point, to understand how they need to be able to view their work through an equity lens, so that as they do their work every day, it becomes second nature to them. They don't have to think about it. So that all of the products that we deliver are being delivered through that lens. And then because we're so large with the projects and the infrastructure funding that we provide, we're seeking partnerships with other entities, Race Forward, PolicyLink, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, to help us scale that to a level where we can provide information, technical assistance, whatever is needed for communities to be able to effectively implement our projects. So we think of it as skill up, hire up, and we got to hire some equity practitioners, by the way. I did skip that. So we got to hire people who've been doing this for a living, in addition to Irene, to be able to help those people like me. I'm not an equity practitioner. It's not what I do. I stay in my lane. I know who I am, but I need people around me who are equity practitioners to help me to understand how to lead and deliver on the work.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like this is part of the conversation we could have for the rest of the day. It's over the last 2 days of the conference, these are all the questions so many of you have come up to me and asked, right? About how do we continue to build skills, about what do we do with our leadership. They are, in fact, again, sort of the core questions of what it takes to do this work. I'm gonna go deep for a second again. I'm gonna come back. I'm going to head to you, Earl, you and some of your HUD peers recently participated in a 10-week discussion about racial equity. Why was it important to seek out opportunities for group learning and retooling as a department?
So good question. As I mentioned, my division, so now I'm going to narrow my comments to specifically talk about my division and what we did, because there were two divisions at HUD that raised their hand and say, listen, we're participating in this equity pilot because we need to know what this is going to look like before we just run this across the agency. For us, we did Race Forward, PolicyLink came in, crafted some material for us, and it was a series. It wasn't as easy as those guys showing up and say, here, do this. Well, there's a couple of tough conversations with ADS Perez and the leadership like, no, that's not how we do work. So we really have to think about how does what you do or what we currently do within the organization fit into an equity lens, and then vice versa. So it took 6, 7 conversations before we got the right template of framework that we thought was going to work. And that resulted in 5 learning labs. 3 of those learning labs were for all the staff. Additional 2 of those learning labs were for senior leadership and managers and folks that we call them charters, but folks who are going to be leading our charter initiatives. And we have a number of those. And those 2 really focus on core teams and action plans. So that was really, really good. And we use that to provide feedback and input into what the agency would do as a whole. I don't know where that is and those discussions are at this particular moment, but I do know that will help inform how does HUD ingrain equity work across the organization. And like I say, it's been a phenomenal experience. It gave us tools we know we didn't have.
Right.
But it also challenged us in a way we probably didn't realize.
Right on. I want to take that idea of both sort of, going from building skills to, clearly, you all had to put together plans. Some instances where felt like you had some of the skills, and some instances where you were building them in real time. But this Nixon, I love the way, Marilyn, that you broke down some of the pieces of your plan. How have you all, but let's start with you, how have you been thinking about accountability? What does that look like, and what does that mean within the plans and within this conversation of engaging staff?
Yeah, so of course you're going to give me the heart.
I am. I know you got it.
It's all good. So part of that is data, right?
Yeah.
Part of that is how we receive data, how we use data, how we set ourselves up for success in terms of making sure we have established goals, and those goals have metrics, and we actually hold ourselves accountable to meeting those, right? So that's 2 things, data and being able to make sure we have metrics. So one of the things we've done as an organization is we have incorporated equity as a priority along with safety, climate, and transformation, 4 priorities for DOT. And those are all incorporated in our strategic plan. So if you go on DOT site today and you do the little drop down on DOT's priorities, equity, I believe, is actually number 1. For those of us excited about that, because it's been safety for the last 50 years. And not saying that safety is not a priority, and I'm going to probably lose my job.
No, you ain't. We got you.
So,
no, you're not.
Equity was listed as number 1. I was excited when I saw that.
About time.
So, and in that strategic plan, which actually aligns directly with the equity action plan, that was very intentional.
Yes.
There is a set of metrics that all of our offices, our modal administrations, as well as our secretarial office will be held accountable to. And so we will have to report out on that every year in terms of progress. And we're also reporting not just to our bosses, but also to the Secretary and to the White House. So from an accountability perspective, I think we've set it up to be successful. We just now have to make sure that we do the work.
Beautiful. Hear you. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Accountability. So 2 or 3 nuggets on accountability from HUD. First, like my friends over at DOT, is one of our core principles in our strategic plan for 2022, 2026. But there are 3 other things I want to mention specifically about accountability and how we're doing that at HUD. First, PAVE. How many of you heard PAVE, the acronym, what it is? recent, right? First of its kind, right? Property appraisal and evaluation equity, right? You guys, nobody's tracking this? Okay, anyway, the Secretary of HUD is a co-lead on that with Senior Advisor Rice. I don't think she's ambassador anymore. Senior Advisor Rice of the White House in helping figure out and reduce bias in property evaluation. That goes back to that link on home ownership. One of the things we further realized in home ownership was property evaluation was impacting wealth generation, right? But first of its kind, there's an interagency task force, a number of federal agencies, I can't remember all of them. I think 13 federal agencies are a part of that, but looking at how do we figure out and then reduce bias in property evaluation, have more equitable outcomes. That's, thank you. The second nugget I'll give you on accountability from a whole agency perspective is criminal justice and specifically in access to housing. More specifically, HUD housing programs. Did you all read what Secretary Fudge said just recently on that particular issue? She asked the agency, I'll back up a few years. Under the Obama administration, we first issued guidance on this particular issue about to our public housing and multifamily housing programs, which we gave them loose guidance on not putting out these blank policies on who can have access to housing, in particularly reincarcerated personnel, doing more to look at the circumstances, the time it's been since that particular incident, and so forth and so on. But Secretary Fudge came back around just last week or so and said, we're going to do more. We're going to go back and look at that, and we're going to look at a number of different other policies and programs associated with criminal history and housing. And then we're going to ask my folks to, in 6 months, give me an update on that so we can figure out what that looked like. So HUD is using two significant particular initiative of efforts to hold ourselves accountable.
Can I just say that in our training work going back to, the early 2000s, that we regularly used HUD's practices around excluding folks with a criminal background as a question on how did local municipalities deal with that. And so I just want to say thank you, for real, for the work.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you. So it looks like, thank you, Kathy. It looks like we've got, and I'm gonna make sure I'm gonna give you a chance. I know we got some questions. I'm gonna jump into them. I'm also clear on time. And so, Matthew, I really do want to hear your thinking about accountability. I'm going to give, what my intention is then is, just so you all know, I'm going to read it like 2 or 3 questions so that you all can decide if there's one in particular you want to respond to. Sure. And then I want to make sure I give you all time for closing thoughts. But accountability.
Sure, real quickly. And in a lot of ways at EPA, like we're kind of built a little trap for ourselves where we have been doing this for 30 years, but we still need the same training that HUD has been doing. And our leadership is aware of that. And that's one of the things that we're working on. But in terms of accountability, since we have been doing this for 30 years, there's a few things that we're finally getting to at EPA. One, we're going to put it in our personal appraisal system, right? We're working on that for senior executives like me and those middle managers that you touched on and ran away from real quickly a few minutes ago. And for just staff, it has to be accountable to every single person in the agency. But the couple of the other things that we're really focused on, meaningful engagement is so important in doing equity and justice work, right? Going out there, engaging with the community, having those relationships, and it feels so good, right, in other parts of the government when they actually start meaningfully engaging and they have those relationships and they don't have to call me to call the folks anymore. Like they know they can call the folks who live, our folks can call the folks who live next to the port. And our chemical folks can call the folks who, are working with the farm workers out in the fields, and they have those relationships, and that feels so good, they're meaningfully engaging. But if you don't turn around and show in the decisions we make what difference it makes, meaningful engagement not only isn't meaningful, it's even kind of worse, right? And for so long, equity and justice work stops at meaningfully engaging. Oh, we talked to them, we're done. You're like, no, you only started. You gotta show it in the decision. And so that's one of the things on our strategic plan that we've made a commitment to. In our significant actions, we're gonna show how those decisions were influenced by that engagement. And if they didn't influence it, we're gonna have to suck it up and say why, right? We're gonna have to suck it up and say why we still made some other decision that didn't go with what the folks being impacted were actually saying. And the second part of that is, we've committed to doing that with the states as well. We're gonna put that sort of requirement as much as we can in our agreements with states when we are handing our authority over to them, because it's not just EPA, it's the whole thing.
I said that I don't think we can overemphasize that last point. I mean, I think we're so poor at accountability, and to be fair, in government, writ large, that that we forget that it's not just saying what we did; it is telling folks why, and why we didn't do some of the things that people asked for. Like, people deserve that information; they really do. I love that one. Okay, I'm going to try to bring in some of your questions, but I will, no shade, but it's clear that we no longer write a lot as adults. You know what I'm saying? Some of us could work on our cursive, that's all I'm saying. So let me start this first one. The topic is getting folks on board. As directors in large federal agencies that I'm assuming have very low turnover, what strategies have you employed to transition tenured employees towards this new way of doing things, especially in thinking about leadership? There's one. I'm going to do three. How will this executive order assist local communities and organizations who are faced with legislative bans at the state level? So the whole preemption question. To end discussions about racial equity. So have you all had any conversations about that jump? There's a few states where there's maybe a little bit of a jump between local municipalities and states. And third question, where do you see the younger generation on this anti-racist work? Are they being groomed to take the lead as senior leaders in federal government, et cetera? How are long-standing equity and social justice leaders in government replacing themselves, formally, informally, for the continuity of the work? Those are some deep questions. Thank you.
Jump in there.
What had happened was, wow. I'll take the last one because I think I can answer that from our experience with Carlton and his group. When we think about, so I think for the first time in U.S. history, we have 5 generations in the workforce at the same time. Wow. Which, if you're not a person who has an adaptive personality or nature, you might be in trouble. I think about in my previous job in Nebraska, the oldest person on my team was 78. The youngest person on my team was 21. Being able to communicate and interact with them was totally different, right? You think about young people in tech savvy, send them an IM, send them a ping, anything you need to do electronically, they're all over. Us older folks, no, I shouldn't say that. Us seasoned folks, nah, you need to come around the corner, talk to me. Let's talk about the game last night. Warm this, grease the skids, and now we can get to what the real issue is. But when I think about this work with equity, what we experienced in my division is senior leadership was on board and wanted to do this. The younger generation, it was their lived experience. So asking them, it was like, well, I don't understand what all the hubbub about. Why haven't we been doing this at HUD? I mean, really, some of them were almost angry, like, we just now doing this at HUD? I was like, yeah, listen, young Pepper, slow down a minute. We're doing some of it. No, but so it's their lived experience. And lived experience account for a whole lot when we talk about this work. But then there was those folks in the middle like me. I consider myself, I'm in middle management. I'm in that generation of folks, I'm not gonna tell you my age, 48 to 58, somewhere in there, ish. Yeah, we grew up in a different era where things were different. We missed the civil rights movement. We're on the back end of this technology thing where my grandson has to program my iPhone for me. Like, what? What are y'all talking about, equity? So it really was, so in summary, it really has been a challenge in getting that middle management folks, really, which are the career personnel, who are gonna be here a little while longer, get them on board. And then last part of that, do I think the younger generation is ready? They have the equity acumen. I challenge them to develop the leadership acumen to go with it.
Here you go. Thank you.
I'll touch on the first two, because I'm younger than you, so I'm just picked up on that. So on the states piece, I mean, I'll say that there's not a state in this country right now that isn't talking to us about equity and justice. Some are using different language. Some of them are doing it much more quietly than others. But one of the ways that we've approached that, and one of the ways that we have encouraged that, and again offered that space of no, come in, let's do this. If you can use data, and if you can show very clearly, speaking from the perspective of EPA, that no, there are communities out there that are not protected. And you can either just drive into them and you can smell it and taste it and see it, or you can, look at data and it's irrefutable, right? No matter how quietly you might have to have that conversation's being had. And again, as advocates advancing equity and justice, we're going to meet them wherever they're at, just like we're going to meet the community wherever the community's at. And we're going to work with them on what we can work with them to try to advance that. And in other areas, and some of those conversations is, when we walk out of here tomorrow, we're going to do this press release and y'all are going to hate it and we're going to hate that. And, we're just going to do that thing in public. And we're like, yep, that's right. We're going to do that thing in public. But we're still going to have that conversation with them behind closed doors. And I think that's one of the things that in this time, as a historian, I'm not a lawyer or a scientist, I'm actually a historian. As a historian, we're still living through an incredibly important period in our society. Like just these few years, what's going on in our society, it's incredible, y'all. This is something that 100 years from now, people are going to look back at these few years and they're going to talk about what we do during this time. And I think a lot of people understand that this is something that's got to be embraced. So that is happening. And then on the other point, just very quickly there's a lot of barriers within the organism of any agency, of any bureaucracy, right? And not to endorse any of the political views in the books, but Carlton cited a book earlier, I'll cite another one. Jill Harrison wrote a book, From the Inside Out, that talks about the barriers and lays out really well all of the different barriers you're gonna face when you're trying to do this work inside a government, and talks about how to start to approach them. We're actually using that and some other stuff to create modules inside of EPA to train our own staff on, here are the barriers you're gonna run into, here are the motivations for those barriers. Some of them explicitly, atrocious motivations, some of them just, ignorance or, misplaced values. And here's how you engage with those things. And that has to be something that we actually train folks for, right? To engage those barriers, to identify them, and to know how to overcome them.
You gonna clap?
Give that some love.
I love it. So I think I'm gonna answer question number 1 and number 3, and you see how most of us avoided like that legislative question in the middle, right?
I did.
Yeah, we're not gonna answer that.
I know. It was.
Just want to let you know.
I'm catching on.
So I'm from the military. I have a military background, so that's probably going to be the premise for my response to questions 1 and 3. And I do want to make sure let's not assume that the people who've been in the organization for a while don't want to change. I come from the perspective, having been an officer in the military, that if the people that I'm working with don't understand the expectations or want to participate, then the question is, what did I not do right? It's not necessarily about them not wanting to be there. They may just not understand what it's all about, so they understand what they need to do, how to do it, and how it benefits them. So when I go into the room and I'm talking about equity, I have to be extremely open-minded, and I assume that everybody in the room wants to be there no matter what your age is, no matter what your gender is, no matter what your culture you come from, that we're all there to have that conversation together. And in terms of how do we bring people along, we have to make sure, one, they're clear on what the expectations are. Two, we have to make sure we provide safe space so that they can have candid conversations on the topic. There are no wrong answers. And I'm going to share an experience with you. I'm going to allow myself to be vulnerable for just a second. You know, military people, we're not vulnerable, ever. So in the beginning of this process at the Department of Transportation, there was a young individual who came to me, about 20 years younger than me, does not look like me, who was upset because they could not understand why they had to give up, as they said, their seat at the table to make room for me. Think about that. But they had the courage to have the conversation with me because they felt like I was open enough to have the conversation with them. Now, true to form, first I was emotional. Like, how dare you ask me that question, right? Yeah. Older African-American female, double degreed. You know, I have a master's degree. And I'm looking at her like, you don't even have half my knowledge and experience. Not necessarily true, but that was the thought going through my mind. So how dare you ask me that question? But I took a step back before I had any of that response, and I said, let me view this from her perspective. And so then I explained to her that it's not about you giving up your seat at the table. It's about making room at the table for those of us who want to be there. And particularly those who've never had an opportunity to be there in the past, or who had to bust open the door, move some chairs to the side, just to make a space for ourselves. So in that process, we both learn from each other. And what I'm saying is, in order to bring people along, we all have to come with an open mind and be willing to have those conversations, be willing to learn and teach and grow together. In the military, I got to trust the person in the foxhole with me. Yeah. You got to have my back, I have to have your back. And that's why I said that's the perspective I come from, is let's all be in the foxhole together. All right, I'm emotional.
Really?
Hey, Glenn, can I?
Yes. Oh, please.
Just a quick caveat to the safe space, because my colleague said something, and it really triggered something that my boss has been pounding us on this. I shouldn't say that, should I? She's been encouraging us on. Yes, no, really go. Encouraging us on, especially during this particular pilot period that we did. So I said I would challenge the younger workforce or younger members in the workforce to develop their leadership acumen. Now I would say I would challenge the seasoned workforce to move those chairs aside, open those doors, pull some folks through there, and create that safe space that I just heard my colleague talk about.
Yeah, get it. Definitely
important to create that space to have the really hard conversation.
Appreciate that. It has been an absolutely beautiful conversation, and I want to, can we give the panel a little bit of love? I have so appreciated the real talk. I know as I've been listening to you all, I know the room is full of nodding heads, and I'm guessing there's hundreds of heads on the Zoom nodding along with us. But it's wrapping up, you know, Matthew, you named it. We are in a historic moment. Like a real historic moment. Like, promise you, your great grandkids are going to be asking about what y'all did in this moment, to your point. Yeah. That is the kind of moment we are in. And that moment is here in part with any radical change. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of anger. And as we all been talking about, a whole world of opportunity, whole world of possibilities. And so closing thoughts about how you're holding the tensions. I won't ask you to talk about states, but how you're holding some of those tensions. And any recommendations you have for folks about how do we lean into the hopes? Marian Kava, activist, organizer, abolitionist, has this beautiful quote, which is, hope is a practice, right? And so what are you all holding, anything you're holding for folks about how we take the possibility of this moment and make it real? So just something simple. If you could do that in like 30 seconds, that would be beautiful. I'm teasing. Share your thoughts. Share your thoughts.
For me, it is, and it goes back to one of the first things again that Carlton said, because it is, I think we should celebrate both the opportunity and the pain, because no growth ever happens without it, and we have to remind ourselves of that. But y'all, all y'all, we are the community, right? We are our tribe, and we need to enlarge that tribe, but we also need to remind ourselves that we're the ones helping to make this happen. And we need to find that comfort and that hope within one another. And so just coming together like this, I was so happy when I found out, like, oh my God, it's actually happening in Port, like they're actually gonna do this in person? And I don't even get to spend that much time here today, but I'm so happy. Like, I'm gonna remember, this is gonna fuel me for months, right? Just being here with y'all today, being up here with y'all on this panel, when you go back to wherever it is you work, with your colleagues, with your teams, when you go home and your kids are asking you about this, right? I mean, I know my daughter, she doesn't always ask me, but I know she's sitting in the corner when she goes home from school listening to me talk about this stuff, and I'm like, she's hearing this. Remember to take those little times to celebrate this with one another, right? Because we are making this happen. We are bending that arc right now in this historic moment. We are bending that arc. And we've got to remember to celebrate that and cherish that and carry that with us, because it's not going to stop being painful, and it's probably never going to stop being a fight.
So like my colleague here from DOT, I too am a military person and kind of a leadership walk. So I'm gonna share my optimism, hope around leadership. What I heard yesterday, specifically in a hot topic conversation around data. I am hopeful and excited and think that the moment is here and it's now, where we have across the country, federal, state, local level, many of you in here, or all of you in here, all of you online, we have the right leaders, right? We are working hard, learning from each other to develop the right policies. And I believe we are going to use data, both aggregate and disaggregate, because we had a wonderful conversation about disaggregate data yesterday. Disaggregate data to really formalize and put this particular work on a path where it's sustainable.
Okay, real quick, in 30 seconds or less. First of all, self-care. This work is challenging. Take care of yourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally, whatever that means to you. Figure that out, because you're gonna need it. Second of all, be present. Mother Teresa, someone asked her a question, how did she manage to accomplish so much and be effective? I live by this. She said, I am present in the moment where I am. Sometimes you gotta leave that phone on the table. Stop listening to other conversations, engage where you are to be effective. And third, have fun.
know, my optimism, when I reflect on 20 years of public service and then now also working with Race Forward, I want to reflect on Michael Allen, who was a former community partnership specialist for the National Park Service. And Michael, when he talks about his journey, he's retired from the federal government now, he explains that when he first started working with the National Park Service, he had to go through a process of thinking critically about what he was seeing as an African American working for the National Park Service in South Carolina. And he asked himself, am I out of place or is my institution out of touch? And what I find encouraging about the conversations that we're having is that civil servants no longer have to feel out of place because their value systems are aligned with centering equity, and their value systems are aligned with making sure that we do things in a way that's ethical, that we live up to our responsibility, that public service truly is a public service, and that we're going to live our values as civil servants to make sure that we do govern for the all. And so that's what I'm optimistic about, is the fact that we are creating the space for civil servants to lead with a sense of care and with a sense of urgency in order to respond to the needs that need to be met.
Beautiful. And on that note, can we give the entire panel some serious love and appreciation? Thank you all so much.